All right, welcome to ProDev. I see some familiar faces. Is anyone new to ProDev? Awesome, welcome. ProDev stands for Professional Development, and it's a way for us to dive more deeply into a coffee topic to a coffee professional audience. Now, anyone's welcome to come. You don't have to work in coffee, you don't have to have a background, but it's definitely geared toward people who do and who want to learn more. Otherwise, you can feel a little lost or overwhelmed with the information. But it's not to present you with any definitive answers. It's just to say, here's some research we did about this topic, and here's what we found. What do you think? It's kind of becomes, hopefully you actually leave with more questions than you had when you came in. That's kind of the goal. So welcome and thanks for coming. Great, this is what we're gonna do today. We're gonna define fermentation. What is it really? We're going to unmask the fermentation stage of coffee processing and talk about how those things are different. Is coffee true fermentation? We're going to discuss the innovative approaches to processing coffees. A lot of people are trying a lot of different things, so we're going to talk about what some of those things are. This definitely won't be definitive, and taste what's going on out there in the world. That's the last part. We're going to taste different processing techniques in the fermentation tank, all derived processing that's experimentation derived in the fermentation tank. So very excited. We'll have plenty of time, hopefully, at the end for questions, conversation. I always look forward to that part. Great. So what is fermentation? Alan is going to, and Victor are going to pass out some fermented things. What we're going to taste is something that's not fermented versus something that is. So we have tea, black tea, and kombucha fermented with black tea. They look very different. Think about what you're tasting and what the difference is between the two. We're also going to taste two breads, one that is fermented, a sourdough, and one that has no fermentation, just yeast to help it rise. So while I talk about fermentation and what it is, you guys can taste the difference. And then we will talk about it in a minute. So, dictionary type definition of fermentation: an anaerobic cellular process of breaking down a substance by bacteria, yeast, fungi, or other microorganisms into simple organic substances and energy. So often that's creating heat. So essentially, we just have microbes that are eating something and generating energy. Yeast break down larger compounds like sugars into smaller ones like alcohol. And that's why kombucha has a little bit of alcohol in it, whether they say it does or not, because those sugars have been devoured, kind of like Pac-Man style, into alcohols. Since yeast and other microbes are present in the air, spontaneous fermentation can always happen at any time if the environment is suitable. So if I have my banana smoothie sit on my counter for a couple of days, spontaneous fermentation is going to start happening because heat, time, proper microbes available, etc., right? Fermentation can also be completely intentional, and we create these recipes and use specific yeast strains to generate a specific result, right? And the idea is that there are all these different yeasts in competition to thrive, and so what we do is we select a yeast that overpopulates the yeast we don't want, that they win out the battle for food and they take over. So we can select yeasts. And there are many factors that affect fermentation. Temperature, like I mentioned, warm things, that's why we have refrigerators, right? Time, if I don't leave something out for long enough, it's not going to ferment necessarily, or fermentation won't run away from me. Amount of food, so how much sugar is involved, how much sugar is in that. My banana smoothie has a lot of sugar, so that will ferment more quickly than something else that's not a banana smoothie. The microorganism strains, certain strains act differently. The amount of the starting strain, so it's almost, of course, we think about it as dose, time, temperature, variety, very brewing type variables. Any questions about what is fermentation? So fermentation and food. Let's talk about how fermentation relates to food first. So as we've tasted those teas, what are the differences between the plain black tea and the kombucha? Because kombucha really is just tea, sugar, and a starter culture. And we use temperature and time to develop that, right? So what are we noticing in the flavor difference between the kombucha and the iced tea? It's fizzy. It has some liveliness to it. Absolutely. Can be some of that energy that's being released. Some of that alcohol is also some of that energy. It's sweeter, right? Is it sweeter than the black tea? There's obviously sugar in it, and all of those sugars haven't yet been consumed by the microbes. It has that kind of funky, vinegary flavor going on, where the black tea obviously doesn't have any of that. So what about the two breads, if you've tasted those? More air, like we talked about the fizziness of the kombucha, sure. But there's that sour flavor. So there's a fermented flavor, right? Is anybody here eat kimchi? Anything like that, those kinds of foods? There's a funkiness and a definite sort of tang to those foods, right? That is present in these that we just tasted, right? Yeah. So that is the fermentation that we're tasting. So fermentation, as I sort of alluded to, historically has been used for the preservation of food, right? Because we help the good bacteria to grow and overpopulate the harmful bacteria. So we have this food that's preserved without refrigeration, before there was refrigeration. I know in Korea they like bury their kimchi so it stays cool, but it also has good bacterias. Food producers like beer makers, wine makers, cheese makers, etc., they create specific foods using specific microbes and recipes that balance all those variables we talked about: the temperature, the time, the certain strains of the yeast, and that kind of thing. Like for sourdough bread, bakers are using a specific recipe and manipulating those variables to create a product that they're looking for. They want that sour flavor in their sourdough bread. Imagine that. The most common species of yeast that is used in the fermentation of food and alcohol, and if I butcher this, I apologize, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is brewer's yeast. So we're all pretty familiar with that on some level, whether we know it or not, if we eat or drink any of these things. And when making wine, beer, kimchi, any kind of fermented food, the yeast is allowed to eat the available energy. The available energy is the form of carbohydrates, like sugars. So that's why we put sugar and tea together to make our kombucha, so that the microbes can eat that sugar. And what they're releasing is alcohol and acids, essentially. So the pH is going down and alcohol is created. So certain wines, they let the sugars be completely eaten and go all the way dry, so that it doesn't taste as sweet as, for instance, your kombucha tasted. And it has a more drying finish because almost all of the sugars have been consumed by yeast and microbes. Does this make sense? We following? Great. And the longer the fermentation goes, the more alcohol, the more gas, and the lower the pH, the more acid is created. So that's why kombucha is not super alcoholic, because we don't let that fermentation take off and eat all of the sugars. And as I just alluded to, deciding when to stop the fermentation is the decision of the person who's making the product, based on flavor, desired alcohol content, those kinds of things. Fermentation has a distinct and identifiable flavor component in the final product, right? We all can taste probably when we're eating sauerkraut versus when we're eating coleslaw. I mean, they're different, but there is also that funk, that sour, that alcohol, that vinegar kind of a flavor, right? So keep that in mind as we move forward and talk about coffee. So how is coffee fermentation different? Does coffee taste like kimchi? No. I've never had coffee that tasted like kimchi. I'm sorry that you have.
It was a problem.
Yeah. Does it taste like sourdough or kombucha, that funky sour vinegar flavor? Hopefully by the time it's made it to us, maybe our coffee departments have tasted coffee that is like that, but ideally we haven't. It hasn't gotten all the way to us. So when we talk about fermentation in coffee, we're talking about a step in the processing. Farmers, producers, green coffee buyers refer to this stage of the processing as fermentation. And really, in wash coffee, we're going to do a quick overview of the wash process, but it's right between depulping and drying. And really, the idea is it's removing the sticky mucilage from the coffee seeds. So that's what you see here in the photograph is mucilage on coffee seeds. And we're using microbes to remove that mucilage. That's what that step of the process is for. Does this process contribute to the flavor of coffee? This is the big question that we will tackle today, but I can tell you we won't definitively solve today. Much to all of our chagrin, I like clarity, check the box, but we don't get that today. A lot of big questions with no real answer, but we can get closer. And hopefully by tasting also we can have our own personal experience about how this contributes. We want to mention this just to put it out there. To make things more confusing, a lot of people call overripe cherries fermenty. Like in a natural processed coffee. In a processed coffee where there are a lot of natural sugars because the fruit is still attached to the seed as it's drying, people will, an overripe coffee can call those natural processed coffees, oh, this is a fermentee coffee. It's actually overripe, and there's totally some fermentation happening in that cherry, but what we're talking about today is the fermentation stage, and we're kind of leaving that natural processed coffee behind. The overripe tends to present as like sour fruits in the cup, and can happen. That's why extreme attention to detail is really important when you're processing natural coffees or honey processed coffees, any processing where there is more sugar available. For example, last year, our Kabewa, which is from Uganda, our Kabewa Natural was put on plastic tarps, and then they had a really heavy rain, and it was very warm, and plastic is not breathable, and so heat generated and did cause a little bit of fermentation. It still made it to our menu. It was still good, but it definitely tasted a little bit more wild than it did this year. So that one thing that happened, true fermentation was likely happening, but it's not always going to go so far as to be like, oh, put it on the compost pile, it's no good. It just changes, it can change flavor slightly. In the wash process, that fermentation stage we're going to talk about, if that's left too long, that's where we start to talk about real fermentee flavors, which are a little bit more savory, and we'll talk about that soon. More like savory and oniony, as opposed to that sour fruit that you find in overripe. Does that all make sense, that difference? Hope we didn't overcomplicate it by even mentioning it, but. Okay, quick overview of coffee processing. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, we wanted to step through it real quickly. Coffee cherries generally ripen from green to red, can be orange, yellow. If left too long, the cherry can become purple and shriveled. You can see up on the top of that branch there, the dark purple cherries. Those would definitely have overripe qualities. Most cherries contain 2 seeds inside. Those seeds are what become our coffee beans, right? And the cherry is hand-picked, and then the coffee is floated. Oh, I want to mention too that when the cherry is hand-picked, if anybody here has eaten many grapes and you pick the grape off from the stem or off of the vine, you have a little hole right where the stem was and some of the fruit is exposed. And that can happen with coffee too. So if we don't process that coffee immediately, fermentation can start happening with the fruit that is exposed. Ida, who we work with really closely, started experimenting, and these are her coffees, experimented with using a knife to cut the stem instead of hand picking the cherries, and she had great results. Terribly inefficient with labor, very expensive to do, but she loved it. So that just shows you that there really is a difference between actually picking and cutting the stem. So there is some exposure of fruit. There is a little bit of fermentation, but if we process quickly, then that can get taken care of. So after they're picked, the cherries are then floated, which means anything that floats to the top is either overripe or underripe. So we can skim those away, get rid of those, and then only take the coffees that are below. And so that first stage happens with all coffees. Now this is specific to the wash process. So after the float test, coffee cherries are depulped. On the left here, you see a depulper, and the coffee goes in the top, and these short teeth sort of tear the cherry, and the cherry is spit in the back. You can see a pile of cherry, and then the seeds are spit into the front. These are depulped seeds here, and then this is the cherry. The cherry can be is very commonly used as compost on the farm, but also, of course, can be made into cascara tea. And then we have fermentation. The sticky depulped seeds are then put in a large tank for the fermentation process to begin. So you see their depulper is attached to the side of the tank. They go right in there, and they can then be fermented. The tanks are usually made of concrete, ceramic, like ceramic tile, stainless steel. They can even be plastic. It really varies. You see a lot of photographs of concrete tanks, but it can vary. We talk about two types of fermentation processes: underwater, which is like this. The coffee seeds, the sticky seeds are covered with water for a certain amount of time to let the microbes do their magic on the mucilage, or without water, kind of like you see on the left side. They're not covered in water. They're just sitting there dry. They're not actually dry. They're just sitting there dry, exposed to the air, which has natural yeasts and microbes. This part of the process can take anywhere from like 6 to 72 hours, which is a huge range of hours. It just really depends on the producer, so many things, their style, whatever. And then after the mucilage has successfully been removed, they're then washed again to kind of get all of that off, and then they move on in the process. When the coffee seeds enter the tank, they're kind of like sticky, slippery. You can tell that there's something on them, and then when they leave the tank, they feel like polished river stones, that are more sort of clean to the touch. You can feel that they're clean. And then they go on to be dried. The coffee seeds are still in parchment, so they have this protective layer over them, and they are laid out to dry either on a patio, as you see here, or in raised beds, which is more ideal. The coffee is turned fairly regularly so that it dries evenly. We like to dry, coffee is typically dried to like a 10 to 12% moisture content, but I talked to our coffee manager, and he was like, actually, ours is a little bit lower. So we do more like a 9 point something to 10% moisture content. And then once those are dry, the beans are bagged up and placed in a warehouse until it's time to export them. And then upon exporting is when they're hulled. So they go from this sort of cream color to we expose the green seed underneath that parchment. And then they're sorted for size and density, exported to where they're supposed to go. So now we're going to get specific about the fermentation tank and what's going on. So as I mentioned before, the goal of the fermentation step is to fully break down that mucilage and dissolve that layer from the seeds so that we can then go about drying the coffee without anything sticky, without extra microbes attached to mucilage. It helps the drying process be sped up. But what's really happening, is fermentation really the best word for that? Because if we think about what we tasted and what we talked about as foods being fermented, beer, wine, kombucha, kimchi, sourdough bread, those all have this distinct flavor that we can recognize as this is fermented. But in coffee, we don't have that. So we were questioning as a group when developing this ProDev, is that actually fermentation? So we went through a couple of terms. So we talked about maceration. So the definition of maceration is to soften, decompose, or separate into parts by the action of a solvent. Does that sound accurate to you all with what's going on? Yeah, it sounds pretty good, right? We could say that the water with the microbes is our solvent, and it's softening, decomposing the mucilage to remove it. But what about when we have fermentation that is without water? Where's our solvent, right? So it's like, okay, not perfect. We weren't satisfied. So, okay, well, fermentation. Again, fermentation is the anaerobic cellular process of breaking down a substance by bacteria, yeast, fungi, or other microorganisms into simpler organic substances and energy. It's a lot of words, but essentially, like, that's definitely what's happening, right? Microbes are eating sugars, which are removing this thing and creating this specific environment. So that's definitely what's happening. But we don't love this definition because, or at least our group didn't love this definition because we are a little bit of a, I don't know if you've noticed, a fermentation craze culture right now. Everyone's talking about fermentation. There's a cold case at Whole Foods devoted just to fermented things. And this doesn't, I can't go around saying coffee's fermented because it doesn't have that flavor. It doesn't have live probiotics in it. It just didn't feel like it correlated exactly right. I don't know if you all agree with that. That definition just feels a little off. It's not zingy. So it didn't feel like a perfect definition. But there's this other definition that someone in the coffee industry, she's more in the yeast industry, but she talks about it as microbial demucilagation. Say that even 2 times, slowly. Not easy. That is more accurate because you're just using microbes to take off the mucilage. Boom, perfect. So that resonated with everyone. That resonates with her as really the most complete and accurate definition. It doesn't leave any question marks. It doesn't associate it with something else that it's not. But nobody calls it that. Nobody's gonna call it that. Lucia might keep calling it that, but at the end of the day, coffee buyers, coffee producers are communicating about fermentation. That's what they call it. So that's why we're gonna keep calling it that, but this is definitely the definition that we landed on that felt most true. Or the term, anyway. Does that feel the most true to you all as well? Can you accept that term if you can say it? Just don't say it out loud, just say it in your head. So now that we're clear about language and we can kind of conceptualize what's actually happening, let's dive a little further into how those microbes are breaking down the mucilage. So when the coffee arrives into the fermentation tank, it's already populated with stuff, with microbes. Soil has it, air has it, the tree, the shrub has it, all of the implements, the depulper has microbes on it. So it's just picking up a natural sort of flora along the way. And the tank itself, depending on how, what the material is and how often it's cleaned, concrete is really porous. Stainless steel, I don't know if anybody has stainless steel, but ceramic is less porous. So that will make a difference as to how many microbes are available. So depending on what the microbe, the natural wild population looks like will depend on how long this process takes and what it kind of looks like. the population of wild microflora is really very dense, and it's made up of yeast, bacteria, and filamentous fungi. So what that means is just fungus that isn't a mushroom. So it doesn't have a fruit like a mushroom. It's more of that spongy, mycelium looking kind of thing. So that is what will be on it. And that population of microflora begin consuming the sugars. And as that's consuming sugar, lactic acid and acetic acid is produced, which then starts lowering the pH of the fermentation tank totally. Whether it's underwater or without water, this stuff is happening. And aside from removing the mucilage from the seed, some scientists believe that the enzymatic byproduct of this stage can add flavor and impact the aroma and complexity of the coffee. But hopefully we're going to continue to explore whether or not that's true. We can find out for ourselves. But also, how far is too far? If there's such thing as over-fermentation, how do we know when it's done? So because the wild microflora is so dependent on so many variables, where you are, how high you are, what the weather's like, what direction the wind is blowing, what's it blowing in. The right answer for how long fermentation should take is not universal. It's very individual. As I mentioned, it can be anywhere from 6 to 72 hours. Those are like documented, but most processes typically take 12 to 48 hours, somewhere in that range, something in the middle. Some of the factors that impact the length of the fermentation time is the environment itself, and the air, the microbes, what's in the soil, exactly how the coffee was processed. I mentioned all of this stuff already. Was it washed before fermentation? Sometimes it will have a clean water rinse before the fermentation stage, which will remove a lot of the glucose, a lot of the sugar. So there will be less food for the microbes and fewer microbes. So that process would, in my mind, likely take longer. How and if the tank was cleaned, if the water is recycled. A lot of times, the water that passes through the depulper will go into the fermentation tank, will ferment for 12, 48 hours. That water will be pushed back through the depulper for the next batch fermentation tank, back through the depulper. So the the fermentation water is being recycled. And so as it goes, it's being inoculated over and over again with more and more yeast, bacteria, filamentous fungi. So that coffee is going to process differently as you go and have this inoculated fermentation water. And more sugar. It's going to be super saturated with sugar as well. And agitation is the last one. You can agitate the tank with a paddle. A few slides ago, we had the paddle, and some people stir it, which of course is going to make that go faster. And there are various sort of non-scientific ways for producers to test if their coffee is done fermenting. And since the goal of fermentation is just to remove the sticky fruit, or the sticky mucilage, it's not, you would think it'd be really straightforward to be like, oh, it's done. But I think it's common for people to leave and come back and go, oh, it's done, but was it done 3 hours ago, or was it done right now, kind of a thing. One study that I read in Nicaragua showed that producers, I love this story, they, in a dry fermentation tank, a without water fermentation tank, they would take a big object, like a stick, and stick it in the tank and pull it out. And if the hole remained, then the fermentation was done. We're like, great, it's now this, doesn't have anything on it, it's not slippery anymore, so this is done. But if the hole filled itself back in, then it wasn't done yet, it needed more time. So you may be able to consider some of the pros and cons of this. The pro, no equipment necessary. Grab something, put it in the fermentation tank, and figure out if it's done. Another pro is that it's like a thing that's worked for a long time for them, so it just is this rhythm that people, I think, are in already. A con is that it's not very quantitative, as you may have imagined. So it can be easier to over ferment. Not that it's going way over ferment. This now tastes like an oniony compost pile, but it can go a little past ideal. And it's also easier to under ferment, which means that you have some sticky mucilage around, which is attractive to microbes. And so you can have some bad bacteria sticking around after the fact and have microbial growth. So that's what they were doing in Nicaragua. So this gentleman here, this is a photograph from Nariño. He's holding a cone kind of cage. And what they do is they fill that with the coffee seed. And then after a certain amount of time, and the volume has reduced a certain amount, I don't know what the measurement is, then they've determined this is done. So now they have a tool, which is great. Okay, let's talk pros and cons. So the pro is it's also inexpensive, not as cheap as just sticking something in there, but it's inexpensive. It definitely has a more scientific element to it, right? It's some form of a measurement, especially if it's used consistently. So that's a benefit. The con is that it's kind of twofold. Like, how much reduced is enough reduced, kind of a thing. How low of a volume does it have to be perfectly achieved? But also, if you leave this and you still don't come back to it for 6 more hours, was it done 5 hours ago or was it done 2 hours ago? It's no different. You have to keep checking in with it, similar to the Nicaragua stick study. So those are some two sort of lo-fi ways of checking if your fermentation is complete. But that same study in Nicaragua went back and they worked to see if it was possible for producers to use scientific instruments on their farms to determine if fermentation was complete. So the first stage of the study was, is it possible? Is it practical to use instruments? And what that study found was that pH was a very consistent measurement of completion. Now, why? Because as the Pac-Man microbes eat the sugars and they're releasing lactic and acetic acid, the pH is going down. So a pH reading is telling you how many of the sugars have been eaten, right? How far along is this process? So that seemed to be a consistent measurement for them. They also found that when the pH dropped below 5, they determined, I thought this was pretty incredible, and this is one study, let's keep that in mind, in Nicaragua, not very widespread. They determined that when the pH drops below 5, fermentation would be complete in about 2 hours. Clockwork. But once the pH drops below 4, over-fermentation would likely begin. So now we have a window. Between 5 and 4 pH, we have this window of ideal fermentation. I almost said extraction. And they did find that the magic number was about 4.6. So we have a goal. We had a window, now we have a goal that we're aiming for, 4.6 pH. So why is this helpful? They found it helpful because producers could start planning their day. They could check in on the pH of their tank and then have some foresight about when that tank would be ready to be washed and moved on to be dried, which helped them plan for labor, for where they need to be at what time, which is actually pretty helpful. And because pH is a quantitative measurement, producers can be more precise in their execution and hopefully manage their quality a little bit more closely. And this also ended up shortening producers' fermentation times because they didn't need to go as long as they thought they did, as long as that stick told them they needed to go. And they also just used really simple pH strips. There was no I don't know if any of you have tested solutions in pools before when you have to drip, 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 drip and shake it up. It was none of that, even that. It's just pH strips, which is very easy to have around or in your pocket. Then they did a second phase of the study to look at specifically if those different levels of pH were going to impact flavor. I don't know if any of you have done any scientific research before, but they had to go in and see if it was possible first, and then a few years later, they then had to write up another proposal and go in and see what the results were in the cupping scores, in the cupping level. So once they knew they could implement pH, they went in and did that study to see if it could increase cupping scores. They were tracking if you went below 4.6, if the score went down, or if you were above closer to 5, if the score was also, to find where that exact sweet spot was. But I'm very sad to say the results were inconclusive. They experienced a really big drop in quality towards the end of the harvest. And so they weren't able scientifically to say clearly if this was just a quality drop or if it had anything to do with pH. So they essentially needed to scrub those results, but the benefit was that they did get to see that this was a very practical thing to be able to, in the field, be testing the pH. So no good news on that front. So the question still remains then, does this fermentation stage impact flavor? Most scientists agree that it impacts aroma. I kept finding that over and over in studies, that fermentation tank linked with aroma. And it's because of its relationship with roasting. The reducing sugars that are sort of developed in the seed come out in the roasting and then impact the aroma, which I find interesting. If I knew more about roasting, I could probably tell you much more about that. So some scientists believe that the mucilage imparts some fruitiness, whether it's in the aroma or in the flavor, to the coffee. But there is no biophysical study that confirms that the presence of fruit compounds in the fermentation tank presents itself in the cup. Nothing conclusive that says that. You would think, oh, especially by the end of the process, there's so many sugars in that tank after it's been depulped and it's so inoculated. But there are no, again, biophysical studies that say that that's true. But some scientists do believe it to be true. And Tim Hill, our coffee manager, he also tends to believe this too. I don't want to speak for him, but he did mention that. That the mucilage actually acts almost like a greenhouse on that green seed. And it insulates and protects the seed from outside influence and allows the natural sugars and enzymes that are already in the seed to develop. So, what is it? Nature, not nurture. Inside, not outside influence is what people are thinking. So, terroir and all of that maybe matters more than what happens in the fermentation tank. Internally, the pectins are fermented into simple sugars, which then impact the aroma in the roasting. Those simple reducing sugars are brought out in the roasting. So again, like I said, Tim tends to agree, Tim Hill, that many of the flavor qualities are inherent in the seed, although there is undoubtedly some impact from the fermentation tank. It's just tough to determine. It's just not always crystal clear. And not every taster is able to necessarily taste that. Ida Batley, who we work with, and we're going to be tasting her coffees, she switched a 12-hour fermentation process from in the fermentation tank for 12 hours. She switched that to a 24-hour fermentation, washed it, and then fermented for another 24 hours. So she quadrupled her fermentation time. And it didn't make the coffee bad. Tim said that the result was more fruited, but it wasn't wild or even off at all. It was just had a little bit of more fruit present in the cup. So I think when we first approached this, we were like, if you over ferment, that's bad and everything goes wrong. And he's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. she quadrupled her fermentation and everything's fine. It does seem like that intermittent wash is helpful. But at Kamavindi, Tim asked for an extra 4 hours of fermentation time, which is a 20% increase. And the reason he asked for it was in the hopes that it would sort of mute the acidity a little bit. He did mention that in East African coffees, acidity can be so high that sometimes they benefit from a little bit longer in the fermentation tank. If the fermentation stage is left way too long, the flavors become more fruited, as I mentioned. Then they become heavily fruited with a lower perceived acidity. Again, this is perceived acidity, not thinking about the pH in the tank, but in our mouths. Then the coffee starts to develop almost a gamey flavor. And finally, it goes into an oniony or compost pile sort of a flavor. So the end result can be very bad, but there's a long path you have to walk to get there. So it's not going to happen. Oh, my pH is 4.2 onions. It's not like that. There's a lot of wiggle room, and tasters' preferences don't always follow science, and they don't always follow pH level in the fermentation tank. So we'll find out a little bit later how considerable, just in the comparison we're going to do, how much of a difference that really makes. Eco-pulpers. Has anyone heard of these? Yeah, they're really great. The goal of the eco-pulper is to be able to more completely remove the skin, pulp, and mucilage layer of the coffee in order to reduce or even completely eliminate that fermentation stage. So you don't even have to, like everything we talked about just is like gone, which is pretty cool. I just realized there's a dog in that picture. So this can be of huge benefit where water resources are limited, right? Because we're not using a lot of water for the washing, although it doesn't take as much water as we think about it taking if they're recycling it with the depulper. This can benefit areas where water resources are limited. Water savings can be huge. The one manufacturer reports using just 227 liters of water per ton of cherries, as opposed to 20,600 liters of water per ton of cherries used with a traditional disc pulper. So they're claiming like pretty much like a 20,000 liter increase without using their machine. I have no way of verifying that, but it could be a huge saving. So any region where there's not a lot of water, it could be helpful. It could be more sustainable. So the question is, well, why doesn't everyone do it? If it's kind of cleaner and uses less water, they're just really expensive, like hugely expensive. Most producers who can afford these have just such a large production that it makes more sense because to have these because of tank space and for fermentation and that kind of thing. So it's just really cost prohibitive for people to use, as you can imagine. Sometimes Tim, again, our coffee buyer and quality manager, sometimes he prefers coffees that are eco-pulped and sometimes he doesn't. So it can be great because you're just removing that whole part of the process and you don't have as much opportunity for off flavor, but sometimes you want opportunity to mute certain flavors or create more. So maybe it's the wave of the future. We'll see what happens with those. But a lot of people do use them still. We just kind of wanted to go through the stages of coffee processing and talk about where people have harnessed fermentation to change the coffee a little bit. At Counterculture, we don't use most of these, but it's interesting to talk about because in my research, these things came up like, oh my gosh, digestive bioprocessing came up over and over again. So coffee cherries. The coffee cherries themselves can be digested and processed by an animal, right? Have we heard of Kopi Luwak or black ivory? Black ivory is with elephants. Kopi Luwak is with the civet cat. There are obviously negative and inhumane implications, and it's very cost prohibitive. But people in these scientists kept pointing back at Kopi Luwak as being so free of acids, no bitterness, just really smooth and wonderful. And so people have developed processes and enzymes to reproduce Kopi Luwak without the civet cat, thankfully. So it's an interesting thing that's happening in terms of trying to manipulate fermentation and processing for a specific result. And then again, during mucilage removal, so if we go from coffee cherry to pulping and then mucilage removal, the actual fermentation tank, something that's happening a lot is people are inoculating the tank with specific yeast strains for a desired result, just like where we talked about with food and alcohol. The green coffee seeds no longer in parchment. Has anyone heard of monsooning coffee? Yeah, I think it started in India, possibly. Either way, monsooned coffee is when green coffee, not coffee in parchment, but the green seeds, after they're hulled, are left to the elements of the monsoon rains, heavy wind, for 3 to 4 months. True fermentation is likely happening during that time, right? Because we have heat, water, and elements. I think it can be done in like containers, like actual physical containers. The idea is that the coffee seeds sort of plump up and they're kind of washed of their acidity, becomes heavier bodied and very pungent in flavor. I think some of that pungency comes from, I don't want to say mold or mildew without knowing that that's in there, but that kind of sitting around flavor, sitting around in the rain flavor. I don't really know what that tastes like, but I can imagine. Essentially, this process is reducing any sugar content left in the green seed and then rehydrating what we already dried out. So it's kind of the exact opposite of what we want at Counterculture for our green coffee. It's sort of reversing what we did by washing it and drying it and saving some of that sugar. Partially roasted and roasted coffee can also be exposed to different enzymes and microbes. There's this thing called myceliated green coffee, where a mushroom-derived enzyme is used at the green coffee stage to reduce bitterness and add nutritional benefits to coffee. Has anyone had this? Have you had it? Our education manager, Emily, knows someone who's really into that. But you can buy it online. I was looking at it. It's myceliated coffee. It sounds really like the next health food craze. But I mean, any benefits from mushrooms, I imagine you're getting from it. But again, reducing bitterness, that's something that came up over and over again, reducing the bitterness of coffee. So maybe they don't know that you can buy good coffee and then extract it well. And then brewed coffee. Finally, we get down to brewed coffee. I couldn't find anybody doing anything to coffee grounds themselves, but the brewed coffee, of course, yeast, lactic acid fermentation of coffee extracts, coffee kombucha. We may have had, I don't know if anyone's had that, coffee kefir, that kind of thing. A fermented coffee beverage would be the final kind of stage. Okay, so the most interesting thing I think on that list, the only thing we're really participating in is the selected yeast strains. This is a really fun thing. I recommend pretty much everything from this slide came from a podcast that the SCA put out with Lucia Solis and Laurent Berthiaud. I don't know how to pronounce it. Any French speakers? And they are yeast people. I don't know what you call that. And they're experimenting with yeast with coffee. But they gave a talk at SCA in Budapest this year, and that talk is a podcast available on SCA's website. It's really great if you have an hour when you're walking around or doing something, listen to it. It's really exciting stuff, but we're pretty much just going to give you a synopsis of it. It's called Pulp Fiction, which is fun, yeah. We wanted to call the ProDev that, but we couldn't rip it off. Lucia worked in the wine industry in kind of the Napa, Sonoma area with Scott Labs. So she knows a lot about yeast, but she's wanted to kind of transfer that to coffee and coffee producers. She worked mostly in the Americas. Laurent worked in like a lab setting, like a small scale he's from France, but he was working with coffees from Africa in much more controlled environment, whereas Lucia was working in the Americas, heavily influenced by the producer and the producer's needs. Some of them wanted to increase their cup score, speed up their processing, save water, in one case slow down their processing. So both of them experimented with underwater and without water fermentation. And something to note is that when you're working with wine, you sterilize the wine of all of the bacteria and microbes, and then you inoculate it with the yeast strain that you want. You can't do that with coffee in the fermentation tank. So the non-inoculated ones, there still was wild or native yeast on it. It wasn't completely sterilized, so they did the testing with the wild yeast, but also versus the inoculated fermentation tank. So although experiments like these are a really good start, the results are pretty inconclusive. We're going to go through them. But the potential benefits are really worth looking into because people are doing this work and claiming that it's really going somewhere. So let's see where it's going. Increased cup score and consistency. The largest score increase that Lucia saw was a 5-point increase, but that was an outlier. Most of her in general, most of her increases were around 1 to 2 points. Our coffee department urges us to remember that quality yeast manipulation is certainly possible, but 5 points is really extreme. You don't see coffees really over 95, so like when we're thinking about 5 points on an 85 to 90, like in a 10-point spectrum, that's really huge. Not to say we don't believe her, but the highest deviation we've seen is a 2-point difference. So take that as you will. Some producers are fermenting really large batches in very short amount of times. Sometimes that's because of temperature or because out of necessity or whatever. So selecting appropriate yeast helped them elongate the fermentation time, which helped them sort of have better development of flavors and improved their cup score. Different yeast strains produce different aroma and flavor characteristics, and that can range from a clean, crisp, and citrusy to creamy, funky, woody. That's used in wine. In wine, you use certain strains to produce a specific flavor profile, and they're looking to do that in coffee as well. The goal is to match strains with varieties to try to bring out certain flavors and match them together so that we get the best result. It also is great for increasing the speed of processing. If there are a lot of coffees coming through a washing station, but you have limited tank space and you have a huge harvest and you need to get them through, otherwise your cherry is going to rot or over ripen on the shrub, you can free up some space by improving your fermentation. If you inoculate more, the microbes are more active and the process can go a little bit faster if you do need it to. You just have to get the right yeast strain. Some yeast strains are better in cooler temperatures, in cooler climates, and can help cooler climate producers speed up their process so that it doesn't take so long. Because if you have cold weather, temperature is a factor, and you do need it to be a little bit warmer sometimes to be faster. Also, a side benefit is that it has made some of her producers' seeds and parchment more uniform and prettier. One of the farmers said that he's getting a better price now because his parchment is pearly white. That was not something she anticipated, but it was this wonderful benefit. Is happy accidents. Also, there's a Q&A at the end of the podcast, and a producer stood up and said, I have used yeast and it killed the coffee borer. In the tank, it was killing the borer beetle. And so that was some benefit that he saw. Lucia didn't have any experience with that, but that shows producers are using these yeast on their own or consulting with people to benefit. And then we're seeing all these side impacts. This is also new. So we don't have the full range of experience yet, but people are coming together to kind of work those things out. Some variables and ingredients of fermentation to think about when it comes to the inoculation of yeast. The variety of yeast. So different varieties impact different characteristics. They thrive in different environments, so you can't just like go buy some yeast and hope for the best in your tank. You really, if you work with someone who knows their yeast, they can help you choose the right one for your environment. And as I mentioned, Lucia wants to sort of build a toolkit of specific yeast strains that match up with specific varieties so that people have that resource. It's pretty easy to manipulate. Once you know what you need, you can buy yeast online. You just have to make sure you have enough so that that yeast wins the battle. And that's the yeast that's taking over and eating the sugars. And again, we're not able to kind of kick back the natural flora and then inoculate and choose exactly the one we want. We have to work with the wild flora and get a yeast that works well with that. The biggest cost has been shipping. The yeast themselves aren't terribly expensive, but shipping to Rwanda is not always cheap. The fermentation ratio is also important. The ripeness and amount of cherry in the batch dictate how many sugars are available. So if your cherry isn't quite as ripe, there won't be as many sugars. So there are all of these variables to consider. And also how many cherries you have, more sugar and more mucilage to eat. The concentration of the yeast is important, as I mentioned. Then there's also the length of fermentation. With selected yeast, the longer the fermentation, the greater the impact on the flavor and aroma is what Lucia's research found, that the longer it went, the more flavorful it became. Her experiments were mostly 12, 36, and 48-hour fermentations. She helped a guy go longer than 6 hours, and she helped another guy go shorter than 72. So she was sandwiching into that nice middle ground. Water is important. Underwater fermentation, she found, tends to be more consistent when you're inoculating the yeast, because the yeast have something to travel in, and so they can approach all of the coffee seeds more equally. Whereas uninoculated fermentation, our coffee department believes, is more powerful when you ferment without water, because without the yeast inoculation, the water just sort of dilutes the process a little bit more, and it happens more intensely when it's without water. Does that make sense? Yeah. The fermentation vessel, again, is important. The tank could be manipulated, but it's very expensive and time-consuming to rip out someone's existing tanks, put in new ones. Stainless steel is an easier environment to control because it's easy to clean, it's easy to seal, but it's also extremely expensive. So coffee producers likely won't go the route of winemakers. Producers more than likely have plastic, ceramic, or tile. Lucia says a tank you clean, a concrete tank you clean is better than a stainless steel tank you don't clean. So for her, she wants it to be a clean environment, which makes sense coming from wine. When she's used to sterilization, for her, cleaning the tank was important just to help ensure that those inoculated yeast strains are definitely going to win the Game of Thrones battle to survive. So the way we at Counterculture intend to start using yeast to improve fermentation is really just so that it's cleaner and possibly quicker. This question came up of like, are we inoculating coffees in the fermentation tank? And we are going to taste some that we have been able to make available. But this isn't something we are wholeheartedly adopting. You won't see like the lactic acid kind of thing on our menu right now, because mostly we're thinking about it as a way to improve the processing, not thinking about it as much from the flavor perspective. As we learned earlier, that most scientists believe, and also Tim Hill, our coffee manager, believes that what is inside the seed is what is actually impacting the flavor. So he posed it to me pretty interesting. It's like either the yeast is helping to remove the mucilage, or it's somehow penetrating into the seed and changing the internal structure and content of that seed. And if you think about it in those terms, it makes more sense to me that it's just removing the mucilage a little bit more effectively in a more controlled manner. I'm not saying that I don't believe Lucia's experiments and Laurent's experiments and their results, because they obviously have them. But if you think about it, everything that we've tasted, there is actually fermentation and yeast in the final product, whereas in coffee, that's not the truth. There's no actual yeast in our final product. Tim is traveling to France this year to do more research with Scott Labs and to learn more about yeast and fermentation, because we want to know, like, is this really happening? Is this really possible? If the mucilage is in the fermentation tank is really just that, making that greenhouse effect, then it doesn't make sense to us that certain yeast strains are going to create pineapple flavors in our coffee. But hopefully we'll find out, because we have some yeast inoculated coffees. So I don't know yet. I haven't tasted these coffees, so we'll see if we can notice any flavor differences. And who knows, maybe it could be from the time the fermentation took and not so much from the specific yeast strain. I don't know. That's just a thought. Cool. Time to taste. So we're going to do 2 tastings. The first one is going to be Kilimanjaro 3 ways. Right after we taste that, we're going to go straight into this Brazil tasting of actually inoculated fermentation. The first one is spontaneous, meaning it's using wild native yeast, nothing different, and then 2 different yeast strains inoculated. And extra shipping on those things.
Yeah, probably.
Refrigerated.
Yeah. Perishable. Cold brew. It's like it's been killed all. Strapped to the back.
You're welcome to follow these gentlemen right behind them and take in some what aroma?
They do?
Thoughts about this side of the table. So we got, sort of our wild yeast, uninoculated control, and versus the 2 inoculated strains of yeast. Thoughts about those? Did they taste yeasty to you? No? I thought they tasted yeasty. I don't know if it was like a brain, again, like a trick, but you didn't taste like that too. Okay. What do you think about the acidity? Did the acidity change at all, or was there more of a flavor difference, or?
A little more sweet.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought this one was the sweetest of the 3.
The sweetest? Did it have anything stand out as being, it's Brazil, so it's a little bit more.
Than that too.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the center one was the most.
Okay. So the tasting notes I have for these from our coffee department, the first one is walnut, sweet, slightly bitter, dry. The second one is nut, mild fruit notes, and soft mouthfeel. And the last one is walnut, sweet, less sharp. Yeah. Yep. So there you go. I felt like there was a flavor difference, but I'm having maybe it's because it's outside of what I normally taste in coffee. I'm having a hard time kind of pinpointing or identifying exactly where that is, but it was almost more clear to me on the other side of the table. But there was a flavor going on that was a little bit new or different to me. I mean, think about on this side of the table, it's like 24 hours in, and then wet or clean water soak, and then, you know, there are all of these ways you could put that together to create something that works for you as a producer, that works for you as a coffee buyer, that tastes the way that you want it to taste. And add in yeast inoculation, and then there's a whole nother level where you can customize this part of the process to work. What does fermentation taste like in coffee? It's not a linear path where we can say this and then this and then this always. Again, it's going to be up to the taster, the producer, depend on the coffee, where it's grown, what it tastes like inherently. But it's not the same as it translates in true fermented foods and fermented products, right? I did not taste any vinegar on the table, thank God. But the coffee industry is starting to push this potential. These are all kind of new ideas, new things that are happening. Now, adjusting your process in the fermentation tank isn't necessarily new, but taking the quantitative measurements, adding yeast strains, all of that is new. So keep your eyes peeled for more information, new coffees on the horizon. And please listen to that SEA podcast. It's an interesting listen if you're on a hike or something. And it's all ultimately up to the taster, I guess, whether or not you can perceive those differences and if you care for them. Happy to answer any questions you might have lingering. Our next ProDev, I'm very excited about. It's about Ethiopian coffee varieties. Instead of saying Ethiopia heirloom as this blanket term for, you know, thousands of varieties of Arabica coffee in Ethiopia, we're instead looking at trying to, kind of verify and identify what those are, at least some of them, so we can be more clear about what we like in these Ethiopian coffees. So we're going to be exploring that, hopefully including Getu, our member of our team who lives in Ethiopia, who is also a botanist working on his PhD, and to help, and part of that process is, for him, is to help identify these Ethiopia heirloom coffee varieties. So we're gonna go deep in Ethiopia, probably taste some phenomenal coffees, I can't wait. So please come back for that. Stumptown, put it in your calendar. Done, got it. Great, so I really appreciate you all coming. Thank you for tasting coffee with us and for being open to hearing more and learning more. And hopefully you have questions. Hopefully you can go back to your jobs or lives and be thinking a little bit more about fermentation and how it impacts coffee. So thank you for being here.